Hi there, and welcome to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrew Murray of Drea Renee Knits, and I'm actually in an Airbnb in New York right now. I'm on my midway stop till I get to Rhinebeck, which is tomorrow when you're watching this. It's actually day after tomorrow for me. But I had to record this on the road because it was a busy week getting out of the house and getting ready for the New York Sheep and Wool Festival. My phone is currently sitting in a plant because that's just how this week's going. I also have no knitwear except for my hat. I think this is the first time ever where I was like, oh my gosh, I already packed up my suitcase. It's in the car. I honestly have to hit the road right after I do this and didn't think about the fact that I didn't have a sweater on. So today's knit is my Harlow hat. This is my hand spun version. I've chatted about it before, but I'll definitely link to my Harlow hats. There is a fingering weight version and a worsted weight version. So I'll throw those patterns in the show notes below in the description box. And let's jump into some questions. By the way, the fiber for this is from Nest Fiber, and I love it. It was such a, I'll give you a little closer look. It's such a fun, unique combination of color. It's one of those colors, like the lavender with the poppy, I wouldn't have necessarily thought to put together, and I just think it's so fun how they ended up working out. And what did I spin? I think I just did a 2-ply, and this was when I was practicing trying to spin a little thicker because I do tend to spin a little bit on the fine side. So this ended up being close to a worsted weight. So let's get into questions. Question number 1. I love your comfy cardigans. Thank you. I have a beautiful DK wool that a friend brought for me from Sweden, and I'm thinking about using it for the Winter Beach Cardi. However, I am one who sometimes likes to button up my cardigans. I am confident I can figure out button placement and button holes because it won't be my first cardigan, but I am concerned about the fit. Since it is designed to lay open, are there any modifications I should make so that it would come together better? I have looked at so many patterns at this point. As I write this, I'm trying to remember if there's even a button band. If not, should I add a stitch to the edge and simply add a button band? Should I add more stitches to the front sides to allow it to close? Is there enough fabric built in that it can easily be closed? Your help is appreciated. So I thought this was a really fun modification to talk about. So for the Winter Beach Cardi, there's not, I feel like this is like slowly slipping down, but you can see me, it's fine. So the Winter Beach Cardi does have on the edges a panel of moss stitching on each side. And so you could definitely use that as your collars, as your button bands for the sweater. What I would do if it were me, and what I think could look really good, and feel free to take it or leave it. So the sweater is designed for those two edges to meet, but not to overlap. That being said, it's worn with quite a bit of positive ease, so there's definitely enough fabric that you could have it overlap. But one thought I had, if you didn't even want to fiddle with buttonhole placement and all that, is to use like a loop and toggle closure. So I think that would go with the style of the sweater really well because it's that fun, cabled, super squishy style, kind of oversized sweater. So if you've ever seen, a lot of times they are wood or bone, and they come with like a little leather or whatever it may be made out of, little loop and toggle. So you'll have a loop on one side and the toggle on the other, and then you can just close it that way. And that way you can really play with like how much you would want it to overlap. You could keep it just barely overlapping so it just meets, but it would be a way to hold it closed without having to modify the actual pattern itself. Otherwise, I do think you could add some buttonholes to that moss stitch section, and you would just want to plan where you want those placed. I kind of wonder if anybody's done it. You wouldn't hurt to peek through the Ravelry projects if you use Ravelry, because I wouldn't be surprised if somebody had done that, added some buttonholes. Another thing you could also do is use a shawl pin or something like that to close it. There's even magnetic closures I've seen. But anyways, the first idea that popped into my head was the toggle, because I feel like that's a really easy addition. But whatever you do, please let us know how it goes. Question number 2. My questions are about the tubular bind off. I know that if you do a 2x2 ribbing and want to do a tubular bind off, you rearrange the stitches so they are knit, purl, knit, purl. So you basically take it down to a 1x1 right before you do the bind off. But why can't or don't you just knit another round of knit, purl instead of the rearranging round? Second part is whether it matters if the rearranging round and or the bind off is done on the wrong or right side. I am knitting a sweater inside out. The right side will be the purl side. Should I flip the sweater right side out before I do the bind off, or doesn't it matter? I'm gonna answer your second question first. I would do the bind off on the wrong side as it is. I wouldn't flip it, because a lot of times the bind off looks a little tidier on the wrong side, and that's gonna end up being your right side facing. So I would not flip it around. I would do it on the wrong side, and I think it would look nice. For the rearranging bit, so you can 100% try doing that. Try doing just a knit purl. I have tried it, and what I found was you have the round that you're going to work knit, purl instead of knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2. Then you do need to do your knit a stitch, slip a stitch, and then your purl a stitch, slip a stitch. So you have your 2 slip rounds. So you now have 3 rounds. That'll basically look like 2 because of those slip stitches. But for me, it felt more noticeable than doing the rearranging. So that was just my personal preference. I think that you should totally try it. I would recommend doing it on a swatch and just seeing what you think. I do know somebody who just does the knit 1, purl 1 and straight in to then 2x2 ribbing, and that's what they prefer. So they actually told me that tip, and I was like, oh, okay, I'll try it. And I just didn't care for it. I didn't feel like it was as seamless looking as that rearranging round. But I would love to know what you think of it. So definitely, this is one of those things that I think can actually be really fun to do a little experiment and just see what you prefer. That you can definitely, it's your knitting, you can do what you want with it. Question number 3. I've been working on your tessellated pullover pattern for Rhinebeck, and I did a little goof and made it about an inch too short on the body. In other projects, I have cut into the sweater and added rows to fix the length, then Kitchener stitched them back together. But with the stitch pattern, I am not as confident that it would work. Do you think that is an option, or do you have any suggestions? So that would be tricky with the stitch pattern. Personally, I don't think I would cut into it because of the slip stitches, and they're so condensed. Like, you only have 1 even row every 3rd round that there aren't slip stitches. And I think it would be really tricky to not have a mess on your hands if you tried to cut into it. So I think what I would do, if it's only an inch, I would add an extra inch of ribbing. So I would probably snip into my cast on edge, unravel the ribbing until that 1 neat row before the stitch pattern starts. And then I would knit down and re-knit ribbing with an extra inch added, and then bind off. That's what I would do. I think that would give you the cleanest, simplest way to do that. And this also made me think back to, so I've talked about this a few times. I've also started talking about it when I do my podcast live, and that is magic numbers. So all I'm talking about when I say magic numbers is they're the measurements you find when you knit that you love on your body. So a certain length from underarm to waist, a certain sleeve length, a certain amount of ease depending on if it's a raglan around yoke or a drop shoulder. All these, like, here's the cropped length I like, here's the full length I like, here's the length I like past my hip. Like, all those different things, we are all unique. Like, I personally have a very short waist, and it can be really hard to find certain ready to wear things that fit me well. because of how short my waist is. I'm really short-waisted and I have a really short length from shoulder to chest, shoulder to bust. So by knowing what measurements really work well for you, you can take out the guesswork, because it sounds like this isn't the first time that happened to you where you're like, ugh, I want more length. And so I would grab one of your sweaters where the length worked out really well for you, that you really like, measure how much length you have from underarm to waist and write that number down. It's also important to consider the length of the yoke on whatever sweater you're looking at, because with different styles, sometimes we do a really exaggerated long yoke. Like, I mean, if you look at where my shoulder is right here in this sweatshirt I'm wearing, down to where my actual underarm is, that's very long. That's way below my armpit. So that's gonna add length to this sweatshirt overall. So I just like to point that out, that you, to keep in mind with some of these numbers, that both of those numbers added together, the yoke depth and the body length, are important to factor in if they have that substantial kind of fun, oversized, anything like that going on. So if it were me, what I would like to do, what I have done in wherever I keep my knitting notes, is I have the numbers of my favorite lengths depending on the style, and then I'll also include my yoke depth, and then I'll just do like a little arrow and those together. And that's when you want to reference the schematic in the pattern you're looking at and kind of just check your numbers, look at their yoke depth for the size you want to knit, look at their body length. And thankfully, length in a lot of patterns is something that's really easy to modify, whether it be sleeve length, body length. That's usually a simple modification depending on if there's an all over stitch pattern, but generally it's a pretty easy modification to make. So having those numbers ready and handy for you might be really helpful in the future, just so you don't have to deal with a situation like this. Given there are also times where it's fun to try a new style, we might be like, oh, I didn't know I would like this length on me, and it worked out so well. So it's great to keep an open mind as you do different patterns in the future, but I just like having those magic numbers to refer to, so that I know, especially sometimes it is a specific style I've knit a whole bunch. I'm like, I just know this is what works for me, and I'm gonna be happiest if I use this amount of ease and this length. All right. Ba-ba. What? Oh, forgot I put this one in here. So in all honesty, I actually chose these questions a few days ago as I was getting ready for my trip. I had the best intentions of filming this before I hit the road, and just chaos happened. I'll fill y'all in on that in another episode once I have found my way through. But in the meantime, things didn't pan out how I had planned, so I forgot that I had this question in here. What is that gorgeous bumpy knit of purple, blue, yellow, and brown on the chair behind you? Please tell me this is something I can make. The colors are fantastic and look so wrappable. I am in love. I noticed it last week as well. Can you spill the beans on this project? Is it your design? So yeah, I have, for the last couple episodes, I had one of my newer shawl designs sitting on the back of my chair. It is a new design. It is knit out of my hand spun, and I am knitting a second version for another sizing option. And then I have one more other idea percolating for this. So it's gonna come out in the new year. It is coming. You will be able to knit it yourself. And I will say it's a really fun knit. If I can toot my own horn there, I'm just really enjoying it. I needed one of those knits that just feels so good. Like, it just is so enjoyable. Knitting your way across it. Like, I'm already knitting a second one and just enjoying every minute of it. So I will definitely keep you all in the loop as it gets closer to a publishing date, but I'm so glad you liked it, and I really can't wait to share it with you, because I'm really, really excited about it. So more to come. All right, last question. In your last episode, you talked about checking gauge as you go to make sure you're consistent. For example, when you're starting sleeves, switching from knitting flat to in the round, etc. But what do you do exactly if you're not consistent? Do you change needles and keep going? Do you rip back and change needles? Should I be adding a lifeline? I'm currently swatching for the DRK Everyday Sweater and can't wait to get started. Thank you. So what a great follow-up question to what we talked about last week. So if you haven't watched that episode, feel free to jump back to episode 136. And we were just talking about staying consistent with your gauge within a project, because what happens is when we go from knitting flat to knitting in the round, or knitting large circumference like the body of a sweater to small circumference like the sleeves, it causes a gauge change for a lot of people. So in general, when we go from large to small circumference, we tighten up. That's why sometimes people find like, oh, these sleeves are a little more snug than I thought they were going to be. A lot of times it's because your gauge can change rather drastically because we tighten up as we're knitting small circumference. And then a lot of times when people go from knitting in the round to knitting flat or vice versa, their flat gauge is generally going to be looser than your in the round gauge. And that's because you're jumping between two things. You're jumping between knitting and purling when you're knitting flat, and purl stitches, generally we end up using a little bit more yarn as we wrap that purl stitch, which means that that fabric can be looser than if we're just knitting every round. So we obviously want to stay as much of an even gauge as we can throughout our project. So I love how you mentioned, like, should we add a lifeline? I think that's such a great idea, because if you are working along and you check and you're like, oops, I totally loosened or tightened up, you don't really just want to switch needles right there, because you're going to have this weird bit of fabric that's either a little too tight or a little too loose that could cause kind of like a ripple, and it's not going to look as nice. So I think that using a lifeline when you are switching from one of these things, knitting to round to flat, flat to round, big to small, etc., just throwing a lifeline in there quick is going to save you a lot of time if you decide, oh yeah, my gauge shifted, I'm going to tear back and start fresh with a different needle size so that I can stay more consistent. For instance, if you're going to try the DRK everyday sweater, most of that sweater is knit in the round. The only part that's knit flat is some back neck shaping. So honestly, I wouldn't even worry about that part. It is such a small wedge of fabric. It's not hugely going to affect your overall sweater. I was just trying to think if I did it in the collar. I don't think I did. I think it's underneath it. So I wouldn't worry about that unless you know you have a tendency to row out. Rowing out is when you knit, generally this is what's happening, you knit tighter than you purl. And so when you're knitting flat, you get these divots in the fabric because your purl stitches are so much bigger than your knit stitches. It can be the opposite, because that's what I did back in the day. It can be that your purl stitches are tighter than your knit stitches. It's just that's not generally the norm. So usually what people need to do if they're rowing out is you're going to use a smaller needle for your purl side rows than your needle for your knit side rows. And that's going to help avoid the rowing out situation. So that's the only thing I would fiddle with in that tiny little wedge. Outside of that, I wouldn't worry about that part. So where I would place lifelines is in the sleeve. So you're already gonna have to put those sleeve stitches on hold. So when you put them on hold, you could even put your waste yarn or your barber's cord, wherever you're using a spare needle to put those sleeves on hold, and just run a little piece of embroidery floss through those stitches at the same time. And when you go to put those stitches back on the needle, keep the embroidery floss in them. Then go ahead and start knitting your sleeve. And if you find that you've super tightened up, which is generally what's gonna happen, you're not usually gonna knit the sleeve looser than the body, but who knows, you could. Then you can just tear back to that lifeline and start again. If you know you tend to tighten up on sleeves, just default to going up a needle size. And still you can check your gauge to make sure that it's staying close to being the same for both. But I know a lot of people who that's just what they do because they know they're going to tighten up on their sleeve gauge. So there you go. Just try to think if I had answered that all properly. I also, I think when I put on my glasses, managed to smudge a little smudge right here. It's right in the middle of my eye, and it's so distracting. So I'm gonna go clean my glasses, but do I have anything left? to say. I might show a little sneak peek of the yarn I'm knitting with right now. I might throw that up on Instagram. I took a cute little video of my beautiful hand wound yarn ball that I did while sitting in a cafe and drinking my coffee this morning as I prepared to hit the road. So I am gonna pack my car back up. I'm gonna hit the road. If you are going to the New York Sheep and Wool Festival in Rhinebeck, New York, I really hope I get to see you there. We're going to be meeting Saturday at 2 o'clock on the hill. Please come say hi. I would love to see you. I would love to see your knits. And if you took part in the tessellated knit along, this year's patterns for Rhinebeck were the tessellated vest and pullover, I would absolutely love if you stayed for our big group photo. So I'll be there with Kate and Rachel from Spin Cycle. Micah will also be there. And then we have Rochelle from Moondrake. Unfortunately, Candace from the Farmer's Daughter Fibers, I won't be in town by the meetup. We're gonna be really sad she's not there, but all the more reason why we have to take pictures so we can show her all the fun. But yeah, we'll take a big group photo at 2:45 and we would love to have you be a part of it. And I can't wait for all the fiber things. I'm still thinking about a fleece, y'all. I'm thinking about it. I saw, was it green county wool? Maybe I shouldn't even say. So leave one for me if you're going to buy a fleece and you see all the CVM. I think it was green county wool. They had CVM is my favorite fiber to spin, and I was like, ooh, I might have to go peek at those. But yeah, this might be my year. This might be my year for a fleece. We shall see. So I would love to know if you're going, if you have a wish list of anything you're trying to find. I also wouldn't mind finding a supported spindle. So as many of you know, if you've been hanging around here, I got into drop spindles. I've learned them. I'm feeling pretty good about them. I can still have a long way to go to improve on them. But I really enjoy using them. But man, there are a lot of people I follow, such as like Pacific Coast Fibers and Tazi, who we've talked about on here, Starlight and Knitting, and all these people who use these support spindles and they make them look like so much fun and they're so beautiful. And I want to figure it out, especially because I have some amazing bats from Melly Knits. If you're a spinner, you probably know who Melly Knits is. I think she might be one of my heroes. I watch all of her Instagram videos on making bats because I'm just so fascinated by the whole process, because she processes raw fleece and turns them into bats, and they're so amazing. So anyways, I would love to spin some of those on a supported spindle because I would rather do them woolen. Oh, there needs to be more hours in the day. Anyways, I'm gonna end this here, but I hope that you all have a lovely weekend. If you'll be with me at Rhinebeck, yay, can't wait to see you there. If you're not gonna be there, I hope you get to do some fun making and have some better weather than it looks like we might have at Rhinebeck. But I hope you get to do some spinning or some fall baking, maybe a little sewing, all those good things. So I hope to see you back here next week, and that's all I got. Bye.